The night was cold, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth through the silent cemetery. The faint glow of the streetlights barely reached the graves, casting long, eerie shadows over the headstones. It was the kind of night where even the bravest souls wouldn't dare to linger. But someone was there. Daniel Carter, a self-made millionaire, had no reason to be at the cemetery that evening. He wasn't visiting anyone, nor did he find comfort in such places. In truth, he had only driven past it by chance. But as he slowed his car near the gates, something caught his eye. A lone figure, small and trembling, sitting on the cold ground near a grave. A girl. At first, he thought it was his imagination. Maybe just another statue among the countless memorials. But as he looked closer, he saw her shoulders shaking. She was crying. Daniel had seen many things in his life. He had climbed his way, up from nothing, faced struggles most wouldn't understand, and built an empire that made him untouchable. But the sight of the girl, broken and alone, stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't ignore. He pulled his car over, hesitating for a moment. Was it wise to approach a stranger in such a place, at such an hour? He knew people weren't always what they seemed, but then, neither was he. Stepping out of the car, he walked towards her, his shoes crunching against the gravel path. The sound made her freeze. She wasn't expecting company. Slowly she turned her head, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and wide, frightened eyes. Daniel stopped a few feet away, raising his hands slightly in a gesture of peace. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Are you all right?" The girl didn't answer. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s, but something about her expression made her seem older, as if life had already worn her down. Her dark hair was tangled, her clothes wrinkled, as though she had been sitting there for hours. He took a careful step closer, trying not to startle her. "It's late," he continued. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "Still," she said. "Nothing." Her fingers clutched at the damp grass beneath her, as if she were holding onto something invisible, something painful. Her eyes flickered toward the grave beside her, and only then did Daniel notice the fresh flowers placed neatly at its base. Someone she loved was buried there. That much was clear. A strange feeling settled in Daniel's chest. He had lost people, too. He knew the kind of grief that made the world feel hollow. He had been where she was, sitting in front of a grave, wondering how life was supposed to move forward when the one person who mattered was gone. Taking another slow step forward, he lowered his voice. "I don't mean to intrude. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I just want to make sure you're okay." For the first time, the girl spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel frowned slightly. It wasn't a warning. It was something else, something fragile. Fear? Pain? He couldn't tell. "I can leave if you want me to," he said. "But I don't think you should be alone." She looked down at her hands, twisting them together as if trying to hold herself together. "I don't have a choice," she murmured. Daniel studied her carefully. Something about her words sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just grief. There was something more. He glanced around. The cemetery was empty, except for the two of them. The wind whispering through the trees. A distant owl hooted, breaking the silence for a brief moment before it settled again into an eerie stillness. "Do you need help?" he asked gently. "I can call someone for you." The girl shook her head quickly. No one can help me." Daniel wasn't sure what to say. He had dealt with struggling businesses, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes deals that could make or break an empire. But this was different. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "Lena." It was a simple name, but somehow it carried weight. as if it held a story far more complicated than he could imagine. Daniel crouched down a few feet away from her, not wanting to invade her space, but making it clear he wasn't leaving. "Lena," he repeated, "I don't know what you're going through, but you don't have to face it alone." She let out a soft, bitter laugh, wiping at her eyes. "That's what people always say." Daniel didn't argue. He knew words meant little when pain ran deep. Instead, he sat there, watching as the wind played with the strands of her hair, carrying away the sound of her quiet sobs. Minutes passed, the silence stretching between them. And then, Lena looked up at him, her gaze filled with something he couldn't quite place. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said again, this time with more urgency. "You don't know what you've walked into." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. There was something in her tone, something that made the night feel even colder. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. She opened her mouth as if to answer, but then a sharp sound echoed through the cemetery, a rustling in the darkness. Lena's eyes widened, and for the first time since he had approached her, Daniel saw it clearly. Fear. Real, raw fear. And just as he was about to turn and look behind him, the lights flickered, and everything changed. Daniel felt the air around him grow heavier, the sudden flickering of the streetlights making the shadows stretch and twist. His instincts sharpened, a quiet alarm ringing in the back of his mind. He turned slightly, his eyes scanning the darkness behind him. But there was nothing, only rows of graves, silent and undisturbed. Lena's breathing had quickened. She clutched her arms, shrinking into herself, as if trying to disappear. It wasn't just sadness anymore. She was afraid. Daniel shifted closer, lowering his voice. "Lena, what's going on?" She shook her head, her fingers digging into the fabric of her sleeves. "You need to leave," she whispered. "Before it's too late." His jaw tightened. "Too late for what?" Lena didn't answer. Instead, she looked past him, her eyes locked onto something in the distance. Daniel followed her gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the towering trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. The silence stretched, thick with something unspoken, and then, barely audible over the wind, Daniel heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone else was there. He stood up, his body instinctively tensing. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer. Only the footsteps, pausing for a moment before continuing. The sound uneven, as if whoever, or whatever it was, didn't want to be heard. Lena gripped his wrist suddenly, her fingers ice cold, against his skin. "Please," she begged. "Go!" Daniel looked down at her, then back at the darkness beyond the graves. Everything in him told him to listen, to walk away from whatever this was. But something deeper, something unexplainable, kept him rooted to the spot. "I'm not leaving you here," he said firmly. "Not like this." Lena's eyes filled with something close to despair. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, a voice cut through the night, low, unfamiliar. "You shouldn't have stopped." Daniel turned sharply, his heart pounding. A figure stepped out from behind one of the larger headstones, barely visible in the dim light. The man was tall, his posture rigid, his face shadowed. Lena's grip on Daniel tightened, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. "No," she whispered under her breath, shaking her head. "Not now. Not here." Daniel squared his shoulders, keeping his stance firm. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man took a step forward, but the light still didn't touch his face. "That doesn't matter," he said, his tone eerily calm. "What matters is that you leave. Now." Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't some random visitor paying respects to the dead. There was something else at play here. Something he didn't yet understand. He glanced at Lena, searching for answers, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. Why? Daniel asked, keeping his voice steady. Why does it matter if I'm here? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if debating something. Then, he spoke again, softer this time. You're standing in the middle of something you don't want to be part of. Daniel frowned. The words sent a chill down his spine, not because they were threatening, but because they sounded like a warning. Lena let out a shaky breath. It's too late, she murmured. The man stiffened. His gaze flickered toward her for the first time, and for a split second, there was something in his expression, something almost regretful. Daniel noticed it. He noticed everything. This isn't about me, Daniel said carefully, his mind working through the pieces. It's about her, isn't it? The man didn't answer, but the silence was enough of a confirmation. Daniel turned back to Lena. Who is he? Lena's lips trembled. Someone I was never supposed to see again. The man inhaled sharply, his fists clenching at his sides. Don't do this, Lena. Daniel looked between them, his confusion deepening. This wasn't some random encounter. There was history here. Dark, painful history. And then, like a puzzle falling into place, it hit him. The grave. The fresh flowers. Lena's quiet despair. Who's buried here? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena's eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth, but before she could answer, the man stepped forward. His voice cold and final. She is. Daniel felt the breath leave his lungs. He turned to Lena, searching her face for any sign of denial. But she didn't speak, didn't move. The wind howled through the cemetery, rattling the branches above. Daniel swallowed hard. That's not possible. But deep down, he knew, somewhere, somehow, he had stepped into a story far bigger than himself. And whatever the truth was, whatever had brought him here tonight, it wasn't over yet. Daniel felt his pulse hammering in his ears. The man's words hung in the cold, night air like a terrible weight. She is. Lena was staring at the grave, her lips slightly parted, her whole body trembling. Daniel wanted to deny it, to find some logical explanation, but something deep inside him knew. This wasn't a mistake. You're lying, he said. Though his voice lacked conviction, the man didn't argue. He simply watched, as if waiting for Daniel to see the truth for himself. Daniel took a slow step back, his breath coming unsteadily. He turned to Lena, desperate for her to say something, anything that would make sense of this. Lena, he said softly. Tell me this isn't true. Lena closed her eyes. I wish I could. The wind picked up again, rustling through the cemetery, whispering between the graves. Daniel felt his stomach twist. Everything in him screamed that this wasn't possible. She was here, standing in front of him, real and solid, but the grief in her eyes, it was the kind of grief that came from knowing something no one else could understand. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. Was this some elaborate trick, a misunderstanding, or was he losing his grip on reality? He turned sharply toward the man. Who are you? The man hesitated before answering. Someone who knows the truth. Daniel's patience was running thin. Then tell me, what is this? Lena finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't belong here, Daniel. His chest tightened. What do you mean? Tears welled in her eyes as she turned toward him fully. I died a year ago. A cold shiver ran down his spine. No, he breathed. That's not. He couldn't even finish the sentence. Lena looked at him with a sadness too deep to fake. I don't know why you saw me tonight, she said, her voice breaking. No one else does. Daniel felt the weight of those words settle on him like a heavy fog. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't trying to explain it away. She was simply telling him the truth. His gaze flickered back to the grave. The name carved into the stone sent a chill down his bones. Lena Carter, 1999. 2024 Carter. His last name. His knees nearly buckled. His mind fought against the realization. But the pieces were falling together too quickly now. The deep familiarity he had felt when he first saw her. The way she looked at him with something beyond fear. Something closer to recognition. Who are you to me? He asked, barely able to get the words out. Lena's lips quivered. You don't remember, do you? The air between them felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Then softly she said, You were my brother. Daniel's breath hitched. No, that wasn't possible. He would have remembered. He would have. Memory slammed into him like a wave, fast and merciless. A childhood spent protecting a little girl with dark hair and bright eyes. Laughter echoing through their small home. Her voice calling out to him, always trusting, always believing he would keep her safe. Then the memories darkened. An accident. Sirens. A hospital room filled with unbearable silence. He had locked it away, buried it, forgotten. A strangled breath escaped him. He staggered back, shaking his head. No, he whispered. I lost you. I remember now. Lena nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I don't know why I'm here, Daniel. I don't know why you can see me. Maybe you weren't ready to let me go. Daniel's throat tightened painfully. The success, the wealth, the cold detachment he had built around himself. It had all been a shield, a way to escape the pain he never wanted to face. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her for who she was. Not a stranger, not a mystery, his sister, his little sister. He stepped forward, his vision blurred with tears. Lena. A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, colder than before. Lena gasped softly, looking down at her hands. They were fading. No, Daniel choked out, reaching for her. She gave him a sad, knowing smile. I think this is why I came back, she whispered, to say goodbye properly this time. Daniel's heart clenched. Lena, please. Her fingers brushed against his one last time. A warmth he hadn't felt in years. You don't have to carry this alone anymore, she said gently. Let me go. He wanted to hold on. He wanted to keep her here. But, deep down, he knew she was right. Tears spilled down his face as he whispered, I love you, Lena. Her smile widened, glowing in the dim light. I love you too, big brother. And then, she was gone. The cemetery fell into stillness. The air was lighter. The weight pressing on his chest lifted, leaving only an ache, deep but peaceful. Daniel stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she had been. Then he looked at the grave again, and for the first time, the pain didn't feel like a prison. It felt like something he could finally face. He inhaled deeply, wiping his face. Then, with one last glance at the grave, he turned and walked away. This time, he wasn't running from the past. He was finally ready to live.